Welcome to another episode of Complete Developer Podcast, the podcast by coders for coders about all aspects of creating your best life as a developer.
I'm Will, the accomplished developer and aspiring software architect.
And I'm Beej, the journeyman developer, sharing my journey in development.
Complete Developer Podcast is supported by listeners like you. We are now on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Complete Developer Podcast.
Throughout your career as a developer, you're likely to work at some well-established companies as well as some that are just getting started. You may even start your own company at some point. Working as or with entrepreneurs, no matter your role, has a unique set of challenges and rewards. We've brought on David Hirschfeld, someone who has both been an entrepreneur and worked with them to see their vision come to reality. And he's going to talk to us about how to succeed in the startup environment. But before we get started, Will, what have you been fighting this week?
I have been paying for my sins. I have a large amount of stuff going on in a database, and it just got a little bit more complicated. Mm-hmm. And then it got a little bit more complicated again. And I don't know if I'm ever going to get out, to be honest. I have somewhere north of 100 stored procedures that I have to change again for new requirements for the system. And so that's basically all I'm doing. I'm now a SQL developer until I escape. So yeah, that's life right now.
Ouch.
On the other hand, I'm way better. I see stuff I wrote in October and I'm like, who wrote this junk? And it's like, oh yeah, I've moved up the learning curve a lot. And I've been using it since 6.5, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not like I'm brand new to SQL, but I have learned so much just in the last, 4 or 5 months that it's unbelievable. So yeah, that's what I've been fighting this week, and I have not entirely been winning. So how about you, David?
So I'm with one of my clients right now. We're building in a visualization piece. So this is a law enforcement customer where he's basically built a system that takes all of the details that normally go on in really complex investigations with like federal investigators, and the vehicles and the wiretaps and the in-flights and 20 or so different categories of information. They all go into the system. They all get related in fixed and in loose ways. And then they use that information then to drill down and create relationships. But what we don't have is a really good kind of like graph style network diagram. So we're in the process of building that right now. And very cool, because now all of a sudden all this data just comes to life.
Nice.
That's really neat.
Yeah, I'm hoping I get some sort of experience that feels that way at the end of my trials and tribulations.
Well, it might be a while if you're stuck in stored procedures.
Yeah.
So I've been dealing with file transfer issues at work this past couple of weeks.
Well, I take it back. I think that trumped your stored procedures.
It does. So we are in the process of digitizing decades of paper files, saving a lot of money in just physical storage space and everything. But so I wrote an app that moves files from a NAS to the long-term storage that we have. And it's going through the testing process and stuff like that right now. There's a couple of things that I didn't really think about when I wrote it, like, network latency, because transferring files from one folder to another, no matter the size on my local machine, works just fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So I've been dealing with that. I actually worked on that some this morning, got most of it resolved. I sent it out to him, and this afternoon I got an email back saying, hey, it's working great. We uploaded all these files over 100 megs, and it only took like 2 or 3 minutes. I'm like, yes. The old system that they were using was not written by a developer. It was written by a business analyst who did, I'll be honest, for someone that's not a developer, he did a great job. Like, he had a lot of issues, but I'm impressed with the work he did because he really put some effort into it. Anyways, it's quite nice. On a happier front. Session 2 of my cover-up was last week, according to when we're recording this. The interesting thing is session 3 is going to be the week before this episode comes out.
So what are you conspiring to cover up? You might ought to tell the audience that.
I've talked about it in previous episodes, but yes. My tattoo cover-up, it's covering the, well, I'll give you guys the advice I've given so many young couples recently. Don't ever get matching tattoos with anyone.
Ooh.
Because that person may not be in your life in a few years. Hey, at least
that's good advice. That's good advice.
Yeah. I'm just glad I didn't get a name. I don't have to worry about that. But yeah. The problem is, like, I go in to get the cover up and everybody at the tattoo place is like, why are you wanting to cover that up? It's beautiful. I'm like, I know, it's awesome. That's why I've waited so long to actually get anything done on it. But I'm kind of tired of, like, looking at myself in the mirror every morning and being reminded, oh, hey, you know? So anyways, it's really cool. It's a Celtic cross with a lot of just personal stuff in there and involved in, like, the wrap around it. It's kind of turning a shoulder tattoo into a half sleeve. So it's really cool. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, and they can do such a great job now. You get a good artist to turn that into something different.
Yeah, I've taken my time finding one, and I'm really happy with the guy I've got. And it's not as expensive as I thought it would be. So I actually got to buy some artwork that I've been wanting to buy because I'd saved up for the tattoo, and I was like, oh, it's not as expensive as I thought.
So this really is a happy story.
Yes, it is. It is. So all that said, guys, we're going to hop on into what we're now calling Book Club. So the second half of the Elements of Computing Systems focuses on the software hierarchy. It starts with a chapter on assembler, and throughout chapter 6, you're going to build an assembler that generates binary code to run on the hardware built in the first half of the book. This is really cool because now you're getting to control the things that you've actually built. Chapters 7 and 8 talk about building a compiler so that you can create high-level code that will compile down and then be translated by your assembler that you built in chapter 6. These focus on the idea of running the intermediate code on a virtual machine, hence the titles of the chapter, Virtual Machine, Part 1, Part 2. Next week, we'll conclude the overview of Elements of Computing Systems, and I'll announce the next book we're going to go through. Will, who's talking to us this week?
Well, we grabbed an iTunes review from Vane CL saying, great podcast. I'm a newbie web developer, and I've learned so much from Will and BJ. This podcast is full of valuable information and insight. Great show. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, Vane. We're really glad that you enjoy the show. We love putting it together each week. It's rewarding to know that we're helping people and that even newbie developers get something out of what we're doing. Send us an email with your contact information to neckbeards@completedeveloperpodcast.com because we've got a Complete Developer water bottle just for you. And guys, if you'd like your very own Complete Developer water bottle, leave us a review in iTunes or comment on the website or any of our social media. We post all our episodes to Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. We're also on Instagram and Tumblr. You can check us out each week where we do a live show talking about what's going on in the tech world and answering some listener questions. Or join the conversation anytime via Slack by going to slack.completedevelopernetwork.com.
Shouldn't it be neckbeard? Only one of you guys.
We used to both have them.
Is that where that came from?
Yeah, and it was a joke, and now we're stuck with it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's good. I like that.
That's a explanation for a surprising number of things in our lives, really.
Yeah, I'm sure after 4 years of doing this, that would be true.
Mm.
Yeah. As developers, we work with various clients to build the technology for their business. Sometimes we even get to work on our own business ideas. While we may not all have the Silicon Valley lifestyle, we will see businesses come and go. We'll see ideas within a business come and go as well. We may even get to be part of that process. We've brought David Hirschfeld on to talk with us about his experience in the industry. We're going to share the insights he's gained about what makes a successful entrepreneur or intrapreneur and how that can be you, your clients, or the person you work for.
David Hirschfeld's software career spans 33 years with expertise in executive management, business management, software development and strategy, workflow automation, technical architecture, and user experience engineering. In the late 80s through early 90s, David provided business development and technology consulting for both commercial and government sector businesses related to IBM data center automation with Computer Associates and Texas Instruments, as well as consulting engagements on projects for several Fortune 200 companies. In the early 90s, David founded and operated VSS, an inventory management and route logistics software company. Over the next 8 years, the company grew its customer base to over 800 companies in 22 countries until it was ultimately acquired in 2000 by a publicly held Canadian logistics firm, where he remained for 2 years as VP of Product Strategy.
In 2006, David founded Techies Incorporated, a software design and development firm focused on user experience visualization, responsive web and mobile app development, as well as workflow automation. He has helped design, plan, manage, and implement projects for a broad range of startups, including existing businesses across many sectors. This includes e-commerce, sales lead management, medical systems, internet auctions, real estate, logistics, and inventory management, social networking, mobile gaming platforms, law enforcement, accounting and finance, streaming technology, and many others. David is also the Chief Technology Officer and a Managing Board member of Anzu, that's anzumedical.com, originally a Techies customer. Anzu has quickly become the leader as a surveillance monitoring platform of implantable products for the aesthetic surgery ecosystem by combining IoT, medical data aggregation, business intelligence, and workflow automation.
So that is like really fascinating to me. I didn't tell you before we got on the show, but before I got into tech, I was in medical school. And I was originally looking to get into medical technology. Here in Nashville, there's a lot of companies, a lot of healthcare companies that have their tech centers here. And so that's the direction I thought my career was going to go before I got into government work. And I actually love what I'm doing now, but IoT is a hobby of mine. And so I think what you guys do there is, like, I looked it up, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it is pretty cool.
So David, we really like to hear people's origin stories. So the first question we like to ask anyone that comes on is, how did you first get into technology?
All right. So my story is a little circuitous in terms of it didn't, it started one way, took a veer off a different direction, and then ended up back into technology. So when I was in high school, and I'm older, so this was really before computers were significant in any way. In the late 70s, our high school, because I went to school in Beverly Hills, we were one of the few high schools in the whole country that had a computer system. Back then, you had to have a system for your school because there wasn't a such thing as a PC or a laptop or anything like that. And I just was fascinated with programming. There were just a handful of us in the school that really caught on to this, but I couldn't sleep at night thinking about how to write code for this thing. And then I went to UCLA and it was a step backwards from that because I was having to learn how to program PL1 on punch cards, and quickly lost interest after I dropped 2 shoe boxes of programs that I had not numbered. So then I went into physics, and then from there I ended up going into technology sales, which is how I ended up with Computer Associates and Texas Instruments. I was doing sales for IBM mainframe software for Computer Associates, and then for government sector sales for Texas Instruments. But I was always frustrated because the systems engineers who did all the technical presentations, I had to schedule them far in advance. And this was right at the time where the first laptop came out. So I bought my first PC just a couple years before. and started to re-educate myself in terms of programming and computers. And then I bought one of the very first laptop on the market. It was a compact laptop, that flips open, and I get on an airplane to go meet with a customer like Sprint, and everybody on the plane would come up to me and say, "Can I see that?" It was you look at it now and you can't even imagine that you can compute something on those devices. But back then that was magic to everybody. But I was frustrated having to schedule the system engineers for the presentations because they weren't as technical or as good at doing the presentations as I wanted them to be. So I just started learning the technology myself so I could do all my own presentations. And then eventually with Texas Instruments, I was doing all my own prototype development this was like $1 million called CASE, computers aided systems engineering systems that generated code. First it was COBOL, and then it was C++, and first, it was green screen stuff, and then eventually it was generating Windows stuff. This is when Windows was really young. Anyway, and then I left there, and I started to do contracting for Intel and Motorola, and because I was the only one in the Phoenix area at the time that knew the beta tools, how to use these beta tools with IEF, which is the name of the product, or I was one of very few people. And so that got me started, and then I started my software company, the one that you were talking about, the logistics and route logistics and route distribution company, and then the rest is kind of history. It's been technology ever since.
I like that origin story. That's
that is cool.
That is really awesome. I think it's really neat that it sounds to me like you were a tech evangelist before tech evangelists were a thing. So we have some friends and fellow podcasters that their day job is tech evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
And what they do is they put together presentations and samples and things like that to go around and show companies, go to conferences, things like that. And it's really cool. I think it's a fascinating thing to do.
Well, and for example, with my clients, even now, I have to tech evangelize things. For example, this network diagram, taking SQL database and then converting it to a graph database so that we can display real-time, very actionable information in a visual, meaningful way. But that was something that my client had never thought of before. So although I got to be honest, making it sound like I did such a great job selling him, all I had to do was breathe it to him and show it to him, and he was all over it, wanting to go that direction.
Yeah.
Sometimes tech evangelism can be really easy when the solution is so obvious, when the technology is such an obvious solution to a problem. And then other times, like when I was selling IEF, this $1 million software development platform, and you had to get buy-in from Fortune 500 companies, and you had to get buy-in from 50 different people before that you had enough consensus to push it over the top. Mm-hmm. That's a whole different kind of evangelism.
Yeah, and I think the coolest thing is when you explain something to somebody that solves a major pain point for them, like that look they get on their face when their eyes light up when they know that the problem can go away. Mm-hmm. That's the win in any kind of sales thing. That's the most satisfying thing for, at least I would assume for you guys too, right? Yeah,
it is for me with my clients when, or sometimes I'm just talking with somebody who isn't necessarily a client, but they've got struggling with a problem. They didn't realize it was a problem that could be solved with technology, and I start talking about ways to solve it, like workflow automation. That's where workflow automation really comes in, and their eyes get big, like, really? I can do that? Some of these things I'm thinking, well, yeah, this is not a big stretch, but to them, this is completely new information.
Yeah, and it's like being a stage magician or something. I mean, you just know the tricks, and all of a sudden, your audience is just locked in. It's the best feeling in the world. Right. You do that for somebody.
Yeah, and sometimes there's simple solutions too.
That's one of the really cool things is when you can do something really simple for a client, or in my world for another division that is asking for something, and it's like, oh yeah, I can do that. Here, let me show you this potential solution, and they're like, wow, I never even thought of that. Mm-hmm. on this line of helping clients be successful, when you're working with clients, what signs do you know of, do you see that point to them being successful?
All right. This is a really good question, and one I feel really close to now, especially having worked with a lot of startup companies over the last 13 years, in addition to my own startup companies before and after. So I have some companies that I work with who have just been incredibly successful, and they all have the same characteristics. And it's not limited to this, but this is a good indicator that you're not going to be lucky, but you're actually going to be successful. One is that what they're trying to automate is something that they are in their own industry that they're working with. Like one of my customers, a Broadway producer, and we automated the idea of how they produce plays. So he knew exactly what the difficulties were, and so when he knew what he needed to do when you automate something like that, how it had to work so that it would now make his life easy. And by making his life easy, it's going to make everybody's life easy that's in stage production of any kind, right? And because he's in the industry, he's connected with everybody in that industry. And so he has reach, and he knows who to talk to and how things get marketed, at least at a certain level. So what I say to people is if they know the business area of the product that they want to develop, they know the end user. They know what the end user needs to be successful with that software. They may not understand the market, but they understand the user. They can figure out the market over time as they start to market the product. So that's one. And the second thing is that they are connected in with so those are the two things. So they understand that market because they're one of the users of that in that market. So they understand the users, and they know how to connect into the market, such as trade shows and marketing platforms and things, because they're consuming that stuff, looking for their own products for other things that they might do. You have those ingredients, and the chances that you'll be successful at some level are really very high. If you don't have those, you just have some cool idea because you think that everybody's going to need this, then you might get lucky, and it might be that cool idea that everybody does need. But more often than not, it's that cool idea that was a cool idea. But trying to figure out how to get the world engaged around it is a whole another animal. And most of those startups most of those guys don't usually make it. You get lucky. You get Tinder, or you get Facebook, or people that were not necessarily in an industry, but they just had the right idea at the right time. They're just such a minute fraction of the world. But the people that are doing something in a business area that they're really familiar with, and they know that this solves their problem, then the chances of being successful are dramatically higher.
Yeah, that matches what I've seen as well. Like there's so many people out there building apps and they don't have a customer. The common advice that I hear is get somebody that will pay for the thing before you even start building it, because that makes people not do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go pre-sell it. And if you can get people, do some nice mock-ups, get somebody to commit to buying it, or even pay for it on a discounted because they can see really beautiful mock-ups so they know what the app's going to look like. And if you get people buying that, you've got a good chance you're going to sell it. But even if you don't do that, like I was saying, if you're in a business domain that you really understand the user and you're solving your own problem at first, and now you know that your problem's common with your user community, your chances of people wanting to pay for that, as long as the problem is significant enough, are pretty high.
Yeah, and I guess that brings up the next thing is, how do you know when a problem is significant enough for somebody else? Like, Beej and I, when we were recording the podcast, like there's certain things that really annoy the daylights out of us, just in podcast audio production and all that. Well, they mainly annoy Beej, but I get messages about it.
Which annoys you.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So it's transitive annoyance. But, there's stuff that that annoys you, but how do you determine what is a big enough problem to put on somebody else and go, okay, how do I, if I create a solution for this thing, how do I know that it's a big enough issue that somebody will pay?
Let's say if it's an annoying issue, but it's not really costing you in any measurable way, like the amount of time that it costs you is trivial, or the inconvenience is trivial, but it's just annoying, then it's going to be really probably difficult to find other people that are annoyed enough to pay for that. But if it really uses up a lot of your time, enough that you would pay money to get that, to solve that problem, and that there aren't other products on the market that easily address this issue, then it's worth taking. And depending on the cost of building the product, it's probably worth taking a shot and developing that, or getting somebody to develop it for you, because you're not alone. As long as you've done a little research in the market and you've looked for something to solve that problem yourself and you can't find it, then you probably have a very large market of people just like you, that if there is a product out there, it's not easy enough to find, that they'll be able to find it. And you make this available to them. And you don't have to be the first. You just have to be easy and available and know how to talk in that network of people that have the same problem, and then you will be successful.
Yeah. I know the Facebook groups are really great for this. I'm in several, talking about audio stuff. I'm in several audio production Facebook groups and in several podcasting Facebook groups. Mm-hmm. And I can see where people's pain points are, because it's based on the questions they ask. Hey, how do you guys do this? What service do you use for this?
Exactly.
Same questions over and over again.
And if those products don't exist for that, then you've got something worth that people will pay for.
Yeah, and if you've got the wording they use, you've got stuff to use in your marketing materials and your SEO for those problems too.
That's actually huge. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So along those lines, mm-hmm. When you're building something or paying someone to build something for you, you want something to get out the door first, a minimum viable product.
Yeah.
How do you define that for your client or for yourself if you're the one building it?
As you define it as small as possible. This is the most difficult thing for startups, and it's even hard for me, and I've been doing this forever and defining these forever. It's very hard to say we can live without that. Okay, first, that it's important to understand the purpose of an MVP, minimal viable product. Because most people think that that's the least amount of something that somebody can use and will pay for. But that's not the purpose of an MVP. It's the smallest thing you can build to deliver some kind of value for the purpose of validating that the market wants that or wants something else. The MVP isn't for making money. So when you put an MVP out, if you don't make a dime on it, that's fine. If you give it to people free and you can see engagement and they're using it and they're giving you feedback to say, yes, this is what I needed, or no, this isn't what I needed, but if you add this, then that will be the product I need. That's its purpose. Because what people do is they build what they think the market wants. And they build a lot of what they think the market wants, and they spend a fortune on this. And there's some people that have what I call can't pull the trigger syndrome, where they just keep adding feature and they won't stop. And this can go on for a couple of years, even for something that could have been, an MVP that could have gone out within 6 months. It doesn't. People are afraid of putting the wrong impression out there, of creating the wrong momentum. These are all fallacies. It doesn't matter what people think of that first product. It's not going to affect their success unless. And what's going to affect their success is that they don't get the right product to people and start selling something that people will consume and want. So that's the purpose. The biggest thing is MVP should be really little. Its purpose is to get people to see that people want to use that and validate what your assumptions were. And if they don't, what's wrong with it? It's because and is it fixable? And if it is, then you might have to put out another kind of MVP plus and get validation. Well, now you say, yeah, I like this. This is good. It definitely has enough value. It's worth paying a subscription model. Or you say, what if I started charging? And say, I'd pay it. Or what if I took it away? No, don't take it away. Just whatever validation you need. Now, you build on top of that.
Oh, I completely get that, because that app that I was talking about earlier, that's in testing right now, I gave them an MVP of based on what they told me they needed, and they got it, and they said, oh, but we need to put validation in here to make sure that the information we're passing in, the searchable information for this file is correct.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh, didn't realize that was part of the MVP. Had to go back and rebuild. We'll just add on. But yeah, that was a whole process. Like when you were describing that, I was thinking, yes, I went through that exact thing the last few weeks of, I put it out there. I said, here's an MVP. They're like, oh, well, it's nice, but we can't really use it because this is what we need to be a true, the basics of what we need.
Now, what would happen if it went out without that validation piece? Would that have put them at real risk in some way? Would that have killed the product in some way? Yes. If they tried to put it, then that is correct. Then that would be the sign of it's not an MVP yet. If there's some critical success, critical survival factor that isn't part of it, then it's not an MVP. So you need these critical survivable things to get feedback. Now, you could take what they did and just start to demo it to the end user community with the idea of getting feedback from them to see, do we build the thing that you guys want before you go investing in that validation, the data validation piece or search validation piece. Yeah. So, but I keep asking my customers that, what happens if it goes out and people don't really think this is the right product? What's your risk? If the risk is true, if it's truly a critical risk, one that they can't recover from, which that's also a hard thing for them to assess, right? But if it's a critical risk and they can't recover from it for some reason, like maybe in a state government, that could possibly be the case, right? Because management will just can the project if you put the wrong thing in front of them. So that might be a critical risk factor. But this is the hardest thing for most people to do. I have some customers that are they're just insightful and about this, and they understand that they can live without 90% of what they want it to be. And they'll put out something really simple in a few months that has hardly any functionality, but is the basic concept. And those people always end up building something different, and they end up creating a business that looks different than what they originally thought it was going to be. Yeah. But they do it quickly because they're willing to iterate fast and get feedback.
That kind of matches some things that I've learned over the years, working with a few startups, is it's almost like your MVP is the price you pay to get feedback from a lot of people that are interested. Yeah. You got to get that out there in front of them. And that's how you buy their time to get their attention and get real usable feedback from them. Because otherwise it's just a kind of an ephemeral idea. It's like, oh, wouldn't it be nice? And it's in the same category as saying, wouldn't it be nice if I won the lottery, versus wouldn't it be nice if I had that $100 that's sitting right there?
So I take that MVP process in two phases. The first phase is we only do high fidelity mock-ups at Techies. The idea of wireframes is great. You can get a design and it looks good and it's appealing and all that, and you see these complex wireframe flows. I don't know about you. I'm not smart enough to be able to imagine the actual behavior of the application looking at one of those things, no matter how sophisticated those things are. In fact, the more sophisticated they are, the harder it is to do. So we do, and just a click-through mock-up isn't enough. It's got to be really a high-fidelity prototype. We use a tool called Axure for that, and you can build products that look like a real end product when you're done, and it behaves and it flows exactly like the finished product, but it's done with mock-ups and some logic in the animation, and in 4 to 5 weeks, depending on the complexity of it, we can end up with something that looks like a finished product, and you can take that and start getting feedback from and doing demos and also showing it to investors. And now the investors' their confidence that you're going to deliver a real product is really high because it looks like you've already done it. It looks like you've already finished it and they like what they see. That's still not an MVP. And that we would actually build much more detailed, like 3 or 4 versions out, so that you can get the whole feel for the end result that you're trying to go after long term. And also you want to impress investors and get feedback about the direction going. Then you, and we don't start any development until that's finished, because this also becomes a great documentation for the developers, so that they're not making any misconceptions about how the app needs to behave. Now, obviously, architecturally is a whole different issue, but in terms of just behavior, the user engagement, since a lot of the apps we do have a big user engagement component. And then we start building. And now we can build the MVP to just a piece of that, the most important piece, so we can get something in front of people, they actually start using it.
So something that I've heard Will complain about is like mocking up a data structure with an access database just to get something up and show, hey, here's what the direction we're thinking of going. And then the client says, okay, use that. And so how do you address that issue with them when you have this kind of mock-up like that, and they're like, all right, well, just use what you got there?
Yeah, well, I used to get in trouble with it, but now I level set expectations right at the beginning. I said the first thing we're going to do is go through a design process and build a prototype, build high fidelity prototype. Nothing in the prototype is usable. It's not a real program, and I'll say this over and over again until they never question it again. So that by the end of it, but you can use this to demo to people, and so they do. So, but I did used to have that problem.
Yep.
It's the I've done. They didn't understand why it's going to be 3 more months or 4 more months. They say, wait, it's done. What did you show me? Just use that. Listen, there's nothing there we can use. It's just pretty looking. It looks like a real system, but it's just pretty.
I think that underscores why you want to make sure that you don't use a real programming environment for some of that kind of stuff, is because you get trapped that way. Whereas if you use a mock-up tool, I've done the same thing with Balsamic, and I've got friends that are currently using tools like Airtable, so they can do a little bit of database access, and they can say, here's kind of how it flows, without it being a real thing. The trick with the Airtable stuff is some of them will use that to get going. Especially if they've got like a lot of data entry that needs to happen on the front end, they'll get that spun up, and then they'll switch over to building the app, and then they move the data from Airtable. But that seems like that has been a pain point. Probably a half a dozen apps I've worked on that have, are supposed to be in like .NET, and they're supposed to be all nice and web based, and it's like, it's a piece of junk access database that we never escape.
Right. You never escape. Yeah. Well, that's why I like Axure, because it doesn't use any data on the back end. It's all in the tool. It's not real data. It's just permitted value lists that you build into the controls, and you can have them react to the particular data that you select, another control. So you make it look like it is behaving exactly like a real app, except that you create kind of user stories and you guide the flow that way. Because you can actually make it so it'll support every user story, but it's too much work. Then now you're building too much into a mock-up tool. I used to use Balsamic. It's just not sophisticated enough. You end up with 1,000 versions of the same screen to show all the different variations of something. Yeah,
the reason I used it was because it very clearly looks like drawings, and nobody wants their app to look like that.
Right.
It's either that or you use like just really ugly colors or something that forces them not to fixate on it.
Right. It's kind of like you have lorem ipsum, text, and then you have really ugly colors, so that so they're not paying attention to that.
So on the flip side of that, what do you do when you present this to the client and they want more, or you start building it and they come in and they ask for more, and kind of the Scrum term scope creep?
Yeah, that's actually a term that predates Scrum by probably 100 years. But
because I can remember it before Scrum too.
Yeah, I think it predated technology actually. There's some people that require a tremendous amount of management, and what I hope to do whenever I get a new client is I vet them as much as they're vetting me. And so before I agree to take on a project, I want to make sure that we're the right kind of partners for each other. Most of the, I'd say 80% of the time they are, but 20% of the time they're not. And I'll, there's projects that I won't take just because I don't think that I'll be able to work with that client because, for whatever reason, usually it's just because they don't think logically, they're struggling with, they're too verbose and pedantic and detailed, and they think that every little many tiniest little things matter. There are certain tiny things that really do matter. Like if there's pixels off on a screen and you don't have columns that line up and little, even if they're a pixel off, those kinds of things matter. That's not the kind of stuff I'm talking about. It has to do with like features and behavior of an app, and you just get a feel, for people, or if I don't feel that the integrity is there, they're not honest. There's certain kind of clients that I'll stay away from, but I digress on that whole thing. The point I'm trying to make is that there's just some clients that do demand a lot, and they're willing to make the investment because this is a representation of who they are. Not just a product that they want to put out, but it's, there's ego wrapped up in it and all that. And I respect that and I understand that. And so we just build a lot more into that first version. Actually, my Broadway client was one of those. He's wildly successful with his product, but he knew what he needed because he works in this world all the time. And so he built a pretty big product right from day one. His MVP was a big complex product. And sometimes you just have to work with those people. But I always question them and say, how critical is this? Does this really need to be in the first version? What's the risk if this goes out, if the product goes out without this? Are you absolutely sure that users will not survive, be able to use, they won't be able to use the product in any effective way without this. And if they are convinced of that, then you go forward with it.
So what else do you use besides that to figure out what's critical? Like, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that maybe isn't, totally critical, but you're going to need it before, a 1.0 release. How do you prioritize those things? Once you're past the MVP point?
So what I do is the very first thing I do with clients, often even before they're clients, like after just a first meeting, I invest a lot of time with a client prior to even contracting them or engaging them. Because, it's up to me to invest in them because they're going to now make a long-term commitment and I want to make sure they're a good partner too. So I'll do a requirements document, high-level requirements, and I'll spend hours with them to really understand what it is they're trying to build, and then I'll document all that and send it back to them. Is this what you want? But this is like many releases, on into the future. And I'll tell them this is, and then I say, when they say, yeah, this is it. And then I say, okay, let's go back through this now and scope this into a roadmap. What's the MVP? And then we step back through that and try to identify the MVP out of there. And I'll ask them, why is that important? What's the business value to this component? And then at that point, usually I engage them. And I also like to do a lean canvas or a business canvas. Are you guys familiar with those?
Yes.
Okay. So I like to do either a lean canvas or business canvas, usually a lean canvas, because I just think it's better for startups on their business, because one of the things that helps them identify the MVP is understanding who they're targeting initially. Mm-hmm. And until they do this lean canvas, they think they're targeting everybody that might use it. And so we say, okay, break this into your 10 different targets, right? And let's pick the two or three you think are the most important targets, and let's do a lean canvas for each. And then they realize, out of those three, there's one that's going to be the least expensive to market to. It's going to have the highest value. And it becomes very easy. Now we're building the MVP for that target, and that makes it much easier for them to accept a more lean product.
Going along with this, when you are getting that product to market, and one of the things about getting that first version, that 1.0 out, is you want to get it out fast. Mm-hmm. And sometimes scalability is not one of your priorities.
Right.
How do you work with your clients, or how do you work when you're planning to scale an app, but you're also trying to get that app out as fast as possible? So
I always try to explain to clients when they're doing an MVP that scalability, don't worry about scalability right now, because it costs a lot of money to make a product scalable. It costs a lot of time and effort, right, to make it really scalable. And of course, it depends on the product that they're building. We want to build something that's efficient, that can handle a reasonable number of users, but just with the idea that this is a starter. app. Because what if they're not successful? They just made all that investment in something that, or if they realize their business is ends up being different and they don't need the scalability that we spend all. Again, it's an MVP issue, right? So, but as long as we architect the product well, decently, then we can start to involve it into a scalable architecture afterwards. And we know what areas of the app need to be scaled and need to be architected. Like, obviously we want to take the things that are the pieces of the app that are going to be the choke points. So Michael Dell, when he was building Dell computers, I always think about this when I'm thinking of scalability. He was interviewed on Forbes magazine, and the interviewer asked him, "So what's your secret to success?" And he said, "Well, I just look for the bottleneck. And that's where all my attention goes. Because as soon as I fix whatever's causing that bottleneck and opens up, now everything flows into whatever the next bottleneck is." And that's kind of how you have to look at the scalability issue. If you're in the rarefied air of an Instagram or a Tinder or, one of these apps, you're going to run into tons of problems as the thing grows out beyond what you can handle capacity. And that's a wonderful problem to have. That's just not what most people struggle with, right? I mean, Facebook was crashing every 10 minutes, sometime in like the end of the first year, while they were trying to figure out how to build a back-end cache for the system back before there was things like Redis and RabbitMQ and, all the, and microservices architecture stuff, right? So, but they seem to somehow recover from that, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I try to tell people. Don't worry about scalability yet. We won't build this so it has to be thrown away and rewritten, but you are going to rewrite pieces of this as you realize that certain aspects of the app are going to need to sit in as independent services that can be asynchronously called in a microservices with some kind of queuing architecture, and you'll put your cache. I mean, all this stuff can come later. This doesn't need to start there. And and then I can show them what it looks like when we do scale something, because we have some big scalable architecture apps that we've built that can handle millions of users.
Yeah, that is pretty good. I mean, I've worked on apps that have had to scale, and doing it ahead of time, I've very seldom ever seen that work. It's usually way better if you just go, okay, where is this thing causing pain? And then you fix it, which that sounds like That's what your strategy is. So speaking of strategies that tend to be maybe a little bit more tailored to what you see out there when the app goes live, at what point do you bring in things like, big data, machine learning, all that kind of stuff?
Okay, so it just depends. It just depends on the product that the client's trying to build. Sometimes the product's a big data product, like with the product that we built for my other business, where we're collecting medical data, put an IoT device out to plastic surgeon's office, then it pulls 15 years of history back from the practice management system right after they plug it into the network. And on the back of the device, they put in a code which we give them that tells the system what office this is now connected. It's the only time they ever touch the thing. And now we have a two-way connection, and we test the connection to the database, and then it grabs 15 years of all their practice management history, and then grabs data every night after that. So this is a big data project. That was the whole purpose. So in that case, big data was right at the very beginning a critical success factor. Business intelligence was a critical success factor. But AI and predictive analytics and things like that, machine learning, those weren't critical success factors at that point. Those came later, after we had the big data and we were able to prove that we could sell this data to industry, and after we realized that there were other companies that needed the data for other reasons, or needed application enhancements to this for other reasons, and that was so this thing just kept evolving and evolving, and so we started bringing in more sophisticated technology, and we continue to. For other products, like my law enforcement product, so we built the basic product first, and then there was a big DEA pilot that went on for 18 months, and they were hugely successful. I just did a case study on that. And then but he built this. Now, this was funny because we had a conversation when we started this 3.5, almost 4 years ago. I recommended he build this as a cloud-based system, and he just felt in law enforcement there's going to be too much concern about data privacy issues, and so we built it as a Windows client server application. Of course, now the clients want it a cloud-based version because that's the whole world's gonna. So we're just starting now rewriting it. So that we have a cloud-based. So we'd have both versions because there will be some people. In the process of doing that, we are starting to identify the other pieces like the data visualization. And I just had a conversation with him today about planning at some point at the end of this year to start doing some prototyping for some machine learning models where it can start to predict behaviors of people who are targeted for investigation based on the patterns of history and the people they're talking to, and start to predict who they may call, and or maybe see certain patterns of people communicating with each other that the investigators might not see, that indicates they just had an event, like maybe there was a big drug purchase or a drug sale, and every time that happens, there's kind of a network of people that all get engaged in certain way. And machine learning can start to find all these patterns. And surface it, and then create some predictions, actionable predictions around this. So he got all excited when I was bringing this up. So, right, but this will be 4 years into this project before we start talking about, actually starting to prototype machine learning stuff. So it really depends on the project. People that think that they should do a startup and machine learning has to go into it right from the very beginning, and it's a dating app or something. It's like, come on, just build. Tinder didn't have any of that, and it was wildly successful. So build something that's more interesting than Tinder, and then we can talk about machine learning.
Another thing that a lot of people really are into is automation, and you talked earlier about automating workflows and things like that. Mm-hmm. When working with or working for a startup, when do you bring this up?
Well, okay, so automating workflows for me is one of the more gratifying things that I get to talk with people about, because it's always a surprise to them that they can get efficiency and buy back time, in their business. And this is usually with people that already have a business running. So I'll give you an example. So there's a group that a networking group that I participate in, and they it's really a business, not really a networking group, business community. But anyway, we have meetings every week, and the person who runs this group is like a machine. He's able to get these meetings ready every single Tuesday, but he spends most of Monday getting ready for these meetings by downloads all the tickets purchased from a ticketing system that is online, and then in spreadsheets he's copying people's bios from the master list of members to the ones that are going to come to that meeting. Then he's adding in guests, and he spends 6-7 hours every single Monday. So I said to him, why don't we automate this for you? We can do this by snapping some products together, the ticketing system, Google Sheets, Zapier, and just copy the data over. And because of the way you get the data from this ticketing system, then we have to build some Google scripts. This isn't like rocket science. This is, a moderate amount of coding to then transform that data and get it into a form, and also have smart forms so that as he copies and pastes a member's name in there, it goes out to a master list and copies in the right values, so that he's got one Google Sheet that represent, and he can get back 5 of those 6 hours every Monday. So now that's that's like 2/3 of a day every week forever, that he just by doing some basic automation. Or a law firm that I'm working with, and I met with them for a completely different reason, but they have these big complex documents they have to put together because of the type of law that they do. And then we started talking about that, and they spend 2 months every single year, the entire firm, locked down while they're doing resubmissions of these documents to all the states and the federal government. And so then we started looking at how they could possibly automate this. And again, it's about basically building a document assembly. This is a much bigger project, obviously, but this could buy back the whole firm maybe 5-6 weeks every single year.
Wow.
Because we'd be able to create the documents, and then they just have to review them and deal with some exceptions instead of having to assemble. These are 200-page documents, and 60 to 65 of them every year they got to reassemble and resubmit, because you have to get approved every year for this sort of thing. That's an example of workflow automation. because they're just taking what they're already doing, and we're just automating the steps that they go through to collect the information they need and then use that to make decisions about how to then put these documents together. It's not magic. This isn't machine learning. It's not graph data, network diagrams that you can drill in and drag cool things around everything. It's not all that cool whiz bang, but it is really cool when all of a sudden you've just transformed somebody's work life because you've made it easier because all this stuff is happening automatically now. So I love that kind of opportunity.
I was just thinking about how much of the stuff that we've got a lot of things automated for our podcast workflow, but there are some pain points that we could probably fix with some automation. And Will was
I was messaging Beach frantically because I was like, I've already kind of started working on some stuff that I haven't told him about because we haven't had a meeting. We're kind of behind on our quarterly, but like the ability to just pop out and fix some of this stuff is huge. So and I call it assembly plus scripts, because a lot of times there's different tools out there that by themselves they won't give you anything, but you snap them together, and all of a sudden you've got a framework for a solution to that automation issue. Yeah, it's almost like it's like the game of Mousetrap, except it's a little bit more stable and it runs a business.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's how a lot of this stuff feels, because I've got Zapier hooks for, a lot of things in our system and IFTTT, and I'm working on some stuff in Airtable for us. So, so speaking of, startup struggles and all that, what are the hardest things to deal with when you're building stuff for a small business or a brand new business?
The hardest things to deal with when they don't pay me.
Well, okay. The second hardest.
The second hardest thing.
Forgot about that one. I don't know how.
Right. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sort of kidding. No, honestly.
I'm not kidding at all.
Right. Yeah. The hardest thing with startups is, first of all, is budgeting properly. Right, that they understand what it's going to cost to launch, because they always think, okay, when are you going to finish? Right. And my first answer to them is never going to finish unless your business fails. Because if it's successful, you're just going to keep enhancing and enhancing and enhancing, because people will want more and more and more. It's probably the 1 in a million software products where they literally build one thing and they're done and that's it. So I draw a graph out even before I engage them. Like, I spend a lot of time pretty much trying to sell people on not using me, because I give them all the stuff they don't want to hear. And then but then usually they appreciate that, to be honest. So I'll draw a graph and I show them a line that's basically kind of a straight line. Obviously it's not, but it goes up to the right on the graph. And that's your cost. And then on the bottom, I draw a line that curves up. Right. And if you're a successful software business, launch will be somewhere, an inch or two on the straight line going up. And then you'll see that you'll have MVP, and you still won't draw the line up until you actually have version, the MVP plus one. And then you start to curve that up. And if you're successful, that curve goes past your cost dramatically. But if you're not successful, then at some point you'll have to stop investing, and then your software costs go down. So if people really get that in their head, they will understand that, okay, this is I'm making a commitment to realizing that after I release this, I may have more investment to do on the software, or I will have more investment to do on the software, and that investment may increase. On the other side, I also try to get people to think in terms of marketing right at the very beginning, so that they are figuring out their brand, their messaging, how they're going to attract their customer, what the marketing channels are, what they cost, and budget that in. And then, of course, the next thing is, how are you going to pay for it? If they have enough money on their own to do this, or do they have to go out and get investment, or do they have investors, and do the investors know how much they're going to have to commit to this? This is one reason why those high fidelity mock-ups really help, because a lot of times they don't have investors yet. They have enough money maybe to get version 1, but not enough really to take the business where it needs to go. So then, while we're starting to do the development, now they can take those scripts out and look for people to invest to give them the seed that they need for the marketing. So that's the hardest thing, is making sure that people are really well prepared for what it takes to launch a company, right? If it's just a single person and they're developing the thing themselves, and that's a whole different world. But if they're engaging a development team like us, then that's the, then they really have to plan, think ahead in terms of what it's going to cost them and when to start these various activities. The other thing is not necessarily with us. It's with other people that have engaged other teams, and there are a lot of really good teams out there, but there's also a lot of teams that don't have the discipline and the experience and the discipline and the protocols in place, and the communication to take a project from beginning to end properly. And the thing with people is they don't know when it's their fault versus when it's the developer's fault, and they'll struggle for months and months and months, a long time after they should have pulled the trigger and made a change. But then they're also afraid, how do I find a team that knows what they're doing? So that I don't switch to another team that's going to be just as bad. So, in fact, I'm just about to publish an article on the 10 signs that your software project's headed for failure, because I think that people don't have something to turn to that helps them understand that, okay, this is what you're struggling with, and the feelings of helplessness, and like you feel like you have to be a watchdog and be pushing everything and boulder uphill. These are all justified feelings, or maybe they're not. Maybe it's, and maybe it's you. So call somebody who's really good at this, because I've talked to people where I realize it's not the development team. It's the client themselves, and they just keep demanding new things and changes, and they're not clear in their description of functionality, and the developers are just being spun in circles, right? Mm-hmm. And it may be a competent team, it may not, but that doesn't matter. That client's got to get control of how they communicate and the expectations they set, and have their own discipline first. So, because they can't be successful no matter who they use, right? But most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the, or I should say, like, probably more than half the time, it's because they're working with a development team that just really isn't at the skill level they need to be for the complexity of the project that they're doing.
Send us a link when you publish that article, because I'll throw it in the show notes for people.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you. I wasn't trying to plug the article. I was just
no, but that sounds. I want to read that article, sure. So I know our listeners will want to.
Okay,
so,
all right, thanks.
Guys, as developers, our job involves making dreams come true through technology. Sometimes those are our own dreams, and sometimes those are the dreams of others. These insights are from a man with experience making those dreams come true. David, we want to thank you for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge with us. How can our listeners reach out to you if they wanted to get in touch?
Okay. And Will and BJ, thank you so much for having me on the show as well. It's been great and it's been fun. To get a hold of me, you can email me at david@techies.com. Techies is spelled TEKYZ, play on words. So david@techies.com. Or you can call me. I'll give you my mobile number. I want people to reach out to me. I really like talking with anybody that has questions. My mobile is 480-570-8557.
All right. Well, thank you again. And guys, that pretty much wraps us up before we close everything out. Will, what do you have for us this week for Tricks of the Trade?
Well, and this kind of fits in with what he was saying, in a lot of respects. When you're developing software, if you can tie a problem that you have back to the financials that created the problem and work backward to fix the financials first, a lot of times you can get rid of the problem. And this is something I think a lot of developers miss. We tend to look at things and go, how do I code around this? And a lot of times what you really want to do is you just want to get more money in, and that covers a myriad of problems much easier. So if you're running into something and you're kind of hitting the wall with your ability to code your way out of it, start backing up and going, okay, what would happen if I could pull some levers here to get more money into the company, where we could get more staff, where we could get better technology, where we could get training. You can fix a lot of your problems by looking at the financial aspects instead of the code first. And that's all I got.
Stand by for Titanfall.
If you have a question or comment, please email us at neckbeards@completedeveloperpodcast.com. Our theme music is an excerpt from Stand By for Titanfall by Pure Bells, available on SoundCloud and licensed through Creative Commons.
The intro music for IoTs is Hillbilly Hip Hop by Jason Belcher.
For references, show notes, and to sign up for weekly emails with extra tips and insights, be sure to check out the website at CompleteDeveloperPodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CompleteDevPod and like our page on Facebook to keep up with news about the show. Catch us each week as we broadcast live, talking about what's going on in the tech world and answering listener questions.
Learn more about all of our shows and groups by going to CompleteDeveloperNetwork.com, where you'll find links to Junior Developer Toolbox, Developer Launchpad, and our other communities. Thanks for listening. See you next time.